This is the Krueger cast, the official podcast of Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 13, Player versus Character. Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of the Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Brackin.
Hey everybody.
And today we're shifting gears just a little bit, but we're continuing our sub-series, if you will, on RPG design discussions and philosophy and play and all this fun stuff. And today we're exploring something that I think is a very fun topic, the idea of player versus character.
Wait, aren't those the same thing?
That's a good question. I think we'll be getting into that as we discuss today. And so one of the ways that I think this tends to come up most often, or at least like the most people sort of bring up, is the difference between, for example, player knowledge and character knowledge.
Oh, yes,
in the
this
game.
is core, seminal, in fact.
And I'm not sure how many rulebooks these days actually bother to talk about it, because I feel like it's almost been such a thing that's been ingrained in people who are role players for a long time, or in games, that it's just kind of implied.
It's kind of like that paragraph, what is role play, that everyone skips? Yeah.
And yet, like, there are still newcomers to the hobby who might not think of this, or, some people who may be more or less strict about this, either with themselves or with each other. And that is to say, the difference between, like, I know something as a player about what's happening.
Yeah.
Or maybe, say, for example, you've split the party and one character over here learns some horrible truth that's going to affect everything. And that is going to get us killed if we don't know it. And so my character, who's in a totally different place and has no possible way of knowing what they just learned, I, as the player, I'm like, I should maybe avoid that trap.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Or don't trust so-and-so, or whatever the case might be. But if you're really playing, like, to use a term that might come across as a little bit too stiff, like with integrity, then you're going to say, like, no, you know what? My character wouldn't know that. I'm going to act as if I don't know that either.
I'm playing my character.
It's what my character would do.
It's what my character would do.
That's just something that's kind of like foundational, I think, to role play, is kind of being able to separate yourself and what you know and what you think from what your character knows and would think.
Yeah. Well, there's mechanics which can help govern this. For example, in D&D, the sort of the classic example here is character alignment. And the joke behind that is, are you chaotic neutral or are you chaotic evil? Because obviously those are the only two, right? But no, and it's actually on a 3x3 grid, which is kind of amazing.
Or at least the original one was. I think they've
simplified
narrowed it down a little bit.
Yeah, but there's no reason you can't go that direction.
It's more fun for the memes on the internet.
Right, so. That's exactly right. But I think that really what it comes down to is this. Are you, as the player, injecting yourself into the character beyond that which you yourself are? And so I'm thinking this might have to be an almost two-part episode here with our next one, because I know what our next topic is. I don't want to delve too far off topic, but this is an important thing, not just for the players, but for the GM.
And I think that, another sort of interesting angle to this too is that as we've played more games as a player, you kind of get into like this sort of meta gaming in a sense, which is I'm going to use in a term that might be a little bit different from some other terms for metagaming, or what metagaming can mean. And what I mean in this case is having the experience as, like, I am a experienced role player, and I'm going to take my knowledge from other games and lessons learned from other games, or things I know about this GM and their tendencies, or these players and their tendencies, and kind of use that to influence the way that I'm going to approach this game.
That's true.
And in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, I know the GM always sets a trap here. So my character is going to, without any particular explanation, decide to check for traps in, like, the most unlikely place possible. Just as an example. And maybe some people are just, like, always overcautious, but that's another example. Players have been so conditioned to, like, check for traps at all times that, like, after they've played in, like, 5 different campaigns, they've gone from a character who checks for traps in, sensible times, and someone who is just like comes across as almost paranoid. And
It's my OCD, man. I got to check for traps.
but without like maybe that doesn't actually suit their character, and like kind of like this little this meta thing of like, to what extent do you separate like your knowledge and your experience from your character's knowledge and experience?
That's a great point.
And I think different systems will have like they'll mean different things in different systems.
Well, and what if your character dies and you bring in a new character into the campaign, and that character has the same class and has different name but a similar background? Basically, you just took your character sheet, you downed them a level, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the same character, really. It's it's his brother. Wait, what? And I think there's a lot of humor about that. I think we give ourselves a hard time over it on purpose. We, we good, honest ribbing over that kind of a thing. But even across, let's call it genres, our group is, and we've talked about this before, we're really big on taking lots of different systems and lots of different stories and doing that. But we've learned each other as players to a point where I kind of know who's probably going to play, the heavy, the brute, the tank, the whatever, the soldier, right? I'm probably going to come in as some kind of a handyman or a priest or something like that. And then there's going to be somebody else who does a different thing, and so we know who the support characters are, and so on and so on and so on. But I guess the question really is, as you play, are you really just bringing in yourself?
Right.
I mean, is ultimately your character just a reflection of you? And if you do it well, is it a reflection of a truer you, or is it a limited version of you, a muted version of you? What would you say to that?
Yeah. And I think that, there's a few different ways you can approach it, and that's not inherently a bad thing to sort of be yourself a little bit. Because I think there's kind of like two prevailing philosophies, even though they might not actually be all that different, which is, do you play role-playing games as kind of like a what if exercise? Kind of like I want to see how I would react to this, or are you playing as almost like an escape? Like I'm going to be somebody totally different from who I am. And, different, like that's not mutually exclusive, and like you can have different people in the same group who are playing in those two different ends of the spectrum, or someone who's kind of somewhere in between, that sort of thing. And I guess that really comes down to like, what is it you're trying to get out of role playing? And so, for me, I kind of related in a way to writing. Authors will talk a lot about how every character they write has a little bit of them in it. As someone who's done some writing myself, not a ton, but like, I sort of know what it's like to pour a little bit of myself or some aspect of myself into a character. It's the write what you know idea. That doesn't just mean write only on subject matter that you're familiar with, but it means to write knowing the truths that you know.
Well, maybe write's not the correct verb here. Maybe storytell what you know is a slightly broader way to state that, which completely applies to our hobby, which is that we are all collective storytellers sitting around. And in this sense, let's see how offensive I can be with this. We're all bards. Is that offensive to the gamer mentality?
It might be.
That we are all at our heart bards.
I kind of feel like it's either the bard is the laughing stock of the group, or it's just like it's probably a common joke. It's like, we're going to do an all bard party.
All bard party.
And that is just like a very specific variant on any sort of fantasy game.
Yes, we'll hide behind the large pile of dead bards. Yes. That's a Gamers 2 reference. If you've not yet had a chance to check that one out, please do. Fantastic film. I think for me, I want to misquote Tim Schafer here and say games are wish fulfillment. I think that, and he was talking about video games, but I think that that's universally true. You know, the concepts of agency and that sort of thing still apply, of being able to be brought into a world and so on, and engage in the fantasy. And I don't mean the genre of fantasy, but I mean the act of fantasizing about something that's not actually happening and not really real. That's what games do for us, whether that be in a more mechanical board game sense, or in a more visual video game sense, or in a more imaginative around the table sense. I think that wish fulfillment is core. It's key. And I don't just mean role play versus role play, as we've discussed before. I mean, it is the glue that holds those two guys together.
And I think we should elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by this, because I think that you and I will interpret that statement in a different way than what you might get on games criticism, talking about wish fulfillment almost in a negative way, which is to say, like, games being accused of basically just being like male power fantasies, as an example.
Oh gosh, no.
Yeah. And so like explain a little bit more what you mean by wish fulfillment.
Well, to be fair, I suppose you could use it for male power fantasies if you want to play a Conan character or something. And I think that honestly, the bad taste in my mouth that comes from the crunchy Brackin style games is exactly that. It's like there's no depth to your character. You have no story. You're just Conan wandering around killing stuff. Who cares, right? As opposed to a character with depth, complexity, and a backstory, and maybe even a character arc and development and roundness and life paths. And I'm pulling all these things from all these different places to say that I think that it's best described as a what if statement. So what if you could play as a Jedi? What if you could be a magic caster in the Lord of the Rings world? What if you could be a neuromancer? What if, and you fill in the what if. So wish fulfillment is really about finding a context for your character. And that means the world in which you're creating, the party in which they exist. You mentioned before, it's, the ROLE can also stand for your role in the party. And what that can mean is if you're playing an Indiana Jones style game, one of you might be Indy, but one of you is going to be Miriam, and one of you is going to be, pick another character. Who's the doofy guy who was the Marcus? Marcus got lost in his own museum, and maybe one of you is playing Sean Connery, his dad, and then that becomes a party in that, and that just suddenly I want to play this, right? Because those are rich characters with context and background, and you're one scene in and you know this, you just know this, and I think role playing well, that's what it's going to be like. Is you're going to have that character interaction and the interplay, and you're actually fulfilling that fantasy of being able to project yourself into that time and that place and that moment and that character and that dialogue, right?
And to be fair, I think that, kind of going back to the male power fantasy criticism, that is valid in some cases. And I think that, some players might go into something kind of with the idea of like, I'm just going to do this thing because I wish that I could just like forget my, say, like morality or whatever else for a minute and just like kind of indulge in maybe negative behavior or something like that. And sometimes, for people, that's a good way to vent. Like, there's some people who'll talk about playing, say, a violent video game as a way to sort of like vent some frustration and stuff like that in a safe and non-harmful way. Understanding that it's not actually like some sort of like control of their violent tendencies. It's just, they don't even think of it that way.
It's about a dopamine hit at that point. But now we're talking biology. We're not talking narrative. And that's a completely different thing, I think.
And so what we're talking about primarily is the wish fulfillment in the sense of that narrative, that role play, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, although there's something to be said for an adrenaline rush in the context of a tabletop RPG.
Because you can get experiences that you wouldn't actually have in real life.
I've had it. Yeah. The cliffhanger moments where we're like, I have to wait till next week to find out what happens next. No, I want to know now. And if you can leave as a GM, if you can leave your players with that feeling, success, huge success.
And so like, it really just does depend on what it is you're going for, what it is you're wanting to get out of the game. And I think too, that in a sense, we talked before about establishing as a group, and this is like, say, between the players and the GM or vice versa, understanding what it is we're trying to achieve with this game and what it is that kind of the expectation that we're all setting for each other, where we know the goal is to tell a good story, or perhaps the goal is like, hey, we're just going to do a dungeon crawl and I'm going to make it challenging, and you guys are trying to overcome these challenges. And those are two very different sort of approaches to the same, well, not to the same game, but Those are two very different approaches to playing an RPG, and different systems might lend themselves better to one or the other.
So I guess what you're saying is, and I if this is true, I would completely agree with it, is that the GM needs to recognize at what level the players are engaging the game as characters, but also as players.
Yeah, because there are a lot of players who do just kind of want to play that tactical game where they're presented with almost like a combat puzzle to solve, so to speak. And the fun they get out of it is kind of solving that puzzle. Whereas players like you and I in our group that we tend to play with, we want to tell a good story, and we're not nearly so interested in all of that stuff.
Yes. Well, I'm recalling a game that we played once, and I GM'd this one, and it was in the Templar setting, which is one of the settings we're working on for Doc and Krueger. And in that particular game, I designed 3 strands, and those strands each had a main character, and each main character was governed by a particular player, played by a player is what I should say.
And then each of us also played a side character in someone else's main
And
thread.
by the end of I think it was about 10 sessions, but by the 10th session, all of the players kind of coincided. They came to the big battle at the end, Battle for Middle Earth, if you will. It wasn't, but it was because it was Templar in America. But the thing about it that I really enjoyed doing in that game as I was designing each of the stories or puzzles, if you like, was that for one player, I knew that they would want to figure it out on their own in their actual brain as a player. And so I constructed the puzzle for them that way. For another player, I made it pretty much about battle. It was very much a beat the thing, and there were demons and there were all these other things involved. And then for the third one, it was very much kind of a lore puzzle and a decision and a character decision. And there wasn't much to fight, but there was a key moment where a treasure had to be decided upon. And so by thinking about each of you as a player and then the characters you had created, which I would say reflected pretty well the typical types of characters you played, be that a dashing commander or a humble priest and let's call it a man of science, right? Being those 3 examples. It really came down to what you guys as players were really looking for in that. And so hopefully that ended up being a good way to do that. So I think that there's an example that comes to my head here, and that is of a webcomic, actually 2 webcomics, which use this idea of a player and character and GM all interplayed as the core of the comedy and the humor. And what's great is they use 2 properties, respectively, that we all know very well, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. And so the first one is called DM of the Rings, and you can find that in the archives of the creators there. And then the other one is called Darths and Droids, which is, of course, D&D.
Yes.
And the conceit of both of those basically is that those worlds, those universes don't exist in the world in which they are playing their game. So there is no such thing as Star Wars in the Darths and Droids player world. And so what we get is, it's all screenshots, it's all screen caps from the movies. And what we get is then the dialogue from the players as they're role-playing their characters to see how it is that they've ended up getting where they've gone. And what's fun is, the D&D, the Darths and Droids one, I should say, is all about going completely off rails whenever the players go a certain direction and want to play their characters player-wise. And then DM of the Rings is all about what happens whenever a GM won't allow them and it's completely railroaded. And one of my favorite moments in that one is, we're fighting orcs again. Good. And it's like at the end of it, you get to the end of it and they're like, because the ring is destroyed. What ring? Well, you remember Frodo. What, that short guy we met at the beginning? He left the party like way back. Yeah. So what you end up with, I think, ultimately is, as players are playing their character, they are going to experience and have fun with whatever it is they're bringing into it, contrasted with the world and whatever that presents. And I think the GM's biggest job of all is to make sure that the players are having fun. And we can think of it in terms of story and character, but if the players aren't really wanting to tell an epic story about denial and betrayal and deceit, they're not going to have fun and it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of brings us full circle back to the idea of separating player and character. And there might be some cases in which what you're wanting to get out of the game isn't necessarily like depth of character. It's more about, I want to play this sort of role and beat the dungeon. And in those cases, perhaps it's a little bit more permissible that the player kind of has that meta knowledge and knows how to play this class and whatever else. And it's more about kind of overcoming that challenge. And, you know, if that same group or if that GM kind of wants to enforce the aspect of like, okay, well, your character wouldn't know that, so I'm not going to let you do that or something like that. How exactly you handle that will vary from group to group. Or maybe people volunteer to say like, oh yeah, no, that's using meta knowledge that I shouldn't have, that sort of deal.
Well said.
In order to kind of get the experience right for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Ultimately, you know, rule number one should be have fun.
Right.
And so it's never the GM versus the players, but it's also not the players versus their characters, if you know what I mean. And so I think that if we really come to the table expecting that we're going to play our characters within that construct of what we've created, I think there's so much potential and our characters can surprise us. And it's a wonderful playground for telling stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone, for this episode of the Doc and Krueger cast, our discussion on player versus character versus GM. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.